Hello and welcome back to another video. In this video, I'm going to be testing and reviewing the Evolution TBL Plus 255mm table saw. Now, my previous table saw video, the Rutlands, I claimed it to be the best budget saw of 2024. Now, that video was actually filmed before this saw actually came out, but I was absolutely bombarded with Evolution is better, this just looks like a knockoff of Evolution. So, in this video, we're going to be doing some slight comparisons to the two, and I'll actually give you an honest review of how this performs. Now, quick disclaimer, I've joined up with Evolution and I'm sponsored by them and affiliated by them, so I've not paid a single penny for this table saw. However, I'm still going to give you my honest opinion because it's YouTube and I feel like everyone lies to you. Starting from the front of the machine, we've got the on button here, and underneath this panel, you've got the off button. You've also got an emergency flappy panel here, which in a moment of panic, you can just punch that, and that's what engages the off button, so it's a much easier button to press. At the bottom of this panel, there is a hole here, and if you push it in, you can then thread a small padlock through it. This keeps the off button permanently engaged, so you can't accidentally turn it on. And just above the panel, you've also got a reset button in case the machine trips. And now we're going to put the handle onto this wheel here. So to do that, you'll be given an orange piece of plastic, a screw, and also a nut. So what you're going to first do is put the nut behind the back of this hole here. There is a little recessed area for it. And then you can just drop the bolt into the piece of plastic. And then using the Allen key / screwdriver they provide with the saw, you can then screw it in. Once the handle's attached, you can then put on the small orange cover that also comes with the saw. And it's this handle here that raises and lowers the blade. It does feel very smooth, it isn't very clunky, which is good. This orange lever here is to adjust the angle of the blade, and to release this, you can just push it down. That releases the mechanism, and then you can use this steering wheel, if you will, to change the angle of the blade. You've got the graph here, which goes all up to 45, which is the max angle that you can set the saw to. And what I really like about this is that you can use this wheel to really fine tune in what angle that you want. And even if I let go, the carriage doesn't fall, even though it's still unlocked. And once I pick the angle I want, let's say 25, I can just push this lever back up and it engages it again, and that's not going anywhere. This lever is more of a compression lever. It doesn't make any kind of click. You just pull it up until it gets tight and then it's in place. Next, we're going to attach the handle onto this cog here, and that's what controls the rack and pinion fence. Really simple, orange piece of plastic with a screw. So let's attach that now. Again, really smooth motion. You can really fine tune what you want here. The cogs, I think they're made of plastic. I have no issues with them being plastic. They feel good enough, but I suppose they're plastic nonetheless. And when you want to lock the fence down, there's an orange lever here, which you can just push down. It makes a click, and then that keeps the fence secure and engaged. This lever is actually really easy to use. I can just use it with one finger. The Rutlands table saw I have at the moment, you have to put your whole palm into it, and it makes a horrible cracking sound, but this just seems really delicate and easy. And this small hole here is just to store the push stick. The push stick really isn't anything special. It's just your generic plastic that you get with pretty much any cheap table saw nowadays. But what this recess is for is just a place to store it. Looking at the right hand side of the machine, there isn't really much on this side, but you've got a handle here if you want to carry it. You've also got a grip up here and one on the other side if you want to carry it from the top. And then you've also got this orange screw here, which I'll show you what that's for now. So now we've got this contraption here. Now this is actually an extension table for the table saw itself. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take these plastic tabs off each leg. Then you need to loosen the screw here and the exact same one on the other side, and then you should be able to thread it through. Once it's in place, you're going to put the plastic tabs that you just took off, and you're now going to put them back on. And those plastic tabs will now act as a stop block, so the extension table doesn't actually fall off. If you don't want to use the extension table, but you still want it on the saw, then you can just re-tighten the screws on either end, and then that should hold the extension table in place. So now we're looking at the left-hand side of the machine. To start off with, we've got the power cord, which is a 230-volt plug, and the cable length is about 3 meters. You've also got 2 plastic tabs here, which you can wrap around the cable like I've done here. Here you've got the 2 wrenches, which you'll use to take the blade off and on. You've also got a plastic bit here, and also a plastic bit here. And this is so if you want to store the saw upright rather than flat. They've also got a storage for a second Allen key that they provide to you. And then you've got this metal tab here, and this is to store the blade guard and the riving knife together. So let me show you how to attach that. So here we've got the riving knife, and here we've got the blade guard. The first thing I want to do with the blade guard is unscrew this screw here. And then there is this rattly bolt here, which you can just undo. You can do it with your hands, but if not, there is a slot if you want to use a screwdriver. Take that into 2 pieces. So now I want to line up this bolt with this hole in the riving knife. So let's just do that real quick. And then it should swivel like that. And now you can get your screws again, and you can thread them through the second hole in the riving knife. And there you go, the riving knife is now attached. So to attach this to the machine, you're going to be given a small little screw like this. And what you're going to do with this is that you're going to rest the blade guard onto that hook. And then if you look up here, there is a hole up here, and you're going to push the riving knife up, and then you're going to put that screw through that hole and tighten it up. And that's in place. It does wobble a little bit. This hook seems to be a lot wider than what it should do, but it is in place nonetheless. Now, although this is pretty cool storage, I can already see an issue that I'm going to have. Now for me, my personal preference is I almost never use a blade guard. I prefer to see what that blade is spinning at all times, and I'd rather not having a blade guard on rather than trying to look through some tinted plastic. I do, however, almost always use the riving knife. But the issue with this setup is you need both of them connected together for it to actually stay on the machine. There's only one hook there, there isn't another one here, so if I was to keep the riving knife inside of the table saw, this blade guard's just going to fall off the machine, and I'm going to have to find somewhere else for that to stay. So looking at the back of the machine now, we've got the dust extraction pipe here, which has a diameter of 63 millimeters. You do also get a adapter inside of the box, which I'll just attach right now. And now it's changed that 63 millimeter hole down to a 35 millimeter hole. Now what I really like about this adapter is that it's got 2 holes. This one being the main dust extraction unit, but then you've also got the second one here, which you can attach a pipe that Evolution give you. And then that feeds all the way up into the blade guard at the top of the saw, so you've got a second area for dust extraction. The pipe that they supply doesn't seem to be that good quality at all. I imagine it's the cheapest that you could probably get. Especially the ends, it is such thin plastic, it's so malleable. And because it stretches over the pipe like that, it's just gonna, over time, I imagine that's gonna stretch and that's gonna split and crack. And I don't know how many times you'll be able to take that off and on before that starts to get ruined. Some hoses, they're more stronger here and they actually insert into the pipe like that, as opposed to going over it and stretching this rim around here. So who knows how long that'll last. And just to the side of the machine, you've got an orange wing nut here with an orange screw. And what this is for is to adjust the tracking of the blade. But I'm not sure if that needs to be done yet, so we won't touch that until a bit later. And just behind that, we've got the motor. This motor is 1800 watts. I believe it spins the blade at around 3000 RPM, and it's also got a soft start feature, so we'll have to see how good that is. And then you've got the two plastic bits here, which is for the mitre gauge. If this top bit here doesn't line up with this piece of plastic here, you can always just unscrew this screw here, and then you'll be able to rotate this piece of plastic so you can get it in line. We'll talk more about the mitre gauge later in the video. So let's look at the top of the table saw now. Now the dimensions are 577 millimeters across and 570 millimeters lengthways. Let's just see how long it is with the extension table on. It's roughly about 862 millimeters. And I believe the surface is aluminium. It does feel strong. It does feel a little bit more rough than my current table saw. I'm not particularly sure why. I think you're probably going to have to put a good amount of wax on that. Let's just check to make sure this is flat. Good. Good. Yep. Cool. Now for those who have eagle eyes, you may have noticed there's actually a small gap between the insert plate and the side of the saw. Now this can actually be adjusted, so let's do that now. To start with, we have to unlock the throat plate itself. So there's a little groove here, which you can use any piece of metal or plastic to use, or a key. But in this case, you can also use the end of one of the blade wrenches with the saw. So just stick it in and twist. The throat plate's now unlocked, so now we can adjust the screws. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put my straight edge down, and I'm going to use the second Allen key that can be found just above where you keep the power cord. And you can see just how big of a gap we've actually got. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen the grub screws, and you should be able to see the insert plate rise. Just make sure you do each grub screw evenly so it doesn't warp the plate. And there you go, you can see that there's no gap now between the throat plate and the surface. So now what we've got to do is we've got to do the exact same thing to the rear screws. When you're happy that the plate is flat, then just re-tighten it. And then that should keep the insert plate locked down. And you just want to double check that the insert plate isn't higher than the surface. You can always just run a straight edge over it just to make sure it doesn't catch. And there you go. Let's check out this insert plate a bit more. So just unlock it again. And then you can use this little tab here to lift that out. Now I am actually really impressed with this insert plate. It's made of metal. It's actually quite heavy in fact, but it won't flex or anything like the cheap plastic ones do. As far as I'm aware, Evolution don't do a zero clearance insert for this table saw. So if you want to try and make your own one, you might also have a bit of difficulty because there are two tabs here which just go into these two slots, which might make it a bit more tricky if you want to try and make your own. So now we're going to raise the blade to its max height so we can actually see what's going on inside. So let's take a look at taking off the blade. Now, first of all, I'm going to recommend wearing gloves, and you're going to use your two wrenches that you can find on the saw. So the first thing I'm going to do is lift this black tab here. This actually has nothing to do with the blade. It's for the riving knife, but it just gives me more space to work with. And then you're going to place one wrench on this nut here, and you should be able to rotate the blade. And then I'm going to put the other wrench down by its side, and you'll just have to spin the blade a little bit until it sits in nicely. And then with the wrench that's in my left hand, I'm going to bring that towards you guys, and the wrench that's in my right hand, I'm going to bring that towards myself. So once you pull both wrenches in that direction, it unlocks, and then you can just hand loosen the rest of the way. And then you can just take off the flat plate, and then you should be able to just take off the blade. This is the stock blade that Evolution supply. It's a 255mm diameter with a 25.4mm bore. It's also a TCT blade, which means tungsten carbide teeth, and Evolution claim that it can cut not only wood, but also steel, aluminium and plastic, but we'll try that out a little bit later. So let's now look at putting the riving knife on. So first of all, you're going to unlock it, which is this black plastic piece here. And then this metal tab here, you can actually just pull it away from itself. And now you've got room to fit your riving knife into. So this metal piece here will slide up this groove in the riving knife, and this hole in the riving knife should also fit within this little piece of metal that sticks out here. And then when you let go, it'll click back into place, and then you can push this lever back down. And then it's in place. And to remove the riving knife, it's as simple as lifting the tab back up and then pulling it to the side and then lifting it back out again. And then of course you can redo that. So before we line the riving knife up with the blade, I want to make sure the blade itself is actually in position as well. And to do that, I'm just going to use a straight edge. I'm going to bump it up against the blade, make sure to avoid the teeth. And I can see that it is exactly 4 inches from the mitre slot. So then bring it up here, same thing again, avoid the teeth. And again, we're bang on 4 inches. Now, had the measurements been different at this end to the front end, then we're probably looking at a blade being out of position. And the way you can adjust that is that lever I showed you earlier inside of the saw, and you can track that correctly. And then you can redo this test to make sure you're getting the same measurement, in this case 4 inches, from the blade to the mitre slot. There is an adjustment for the riving knife, which is these 2 bolts here. Now this is what adjusts the tracking of the riving knife. The camera is perfectly in line with the riving knife, or the blade should I say, and you can see the riving knife is actually sticking just towards the left. It should be in line with the blade like so. So we need to make an adjustment with these 2 bolts here. So now it's just a very fiddly game of trying to get that to sit in line. So let's give that a go. So I cannot for the life of me get this riving knife straight. The blade is a perfect 90 degrees, but this riving knife has a tendency to want to bend to the left. And the issue I'm finding is that even if I loosen the riving knife up, so now I can move back and forth, the moment I tighten it up, even if I get it perfectly in line, it just bends to the left like that again. And I think it's to do with the actual mechanism that holds the riving knife in place. See, from here, that doesn't look too bad. But then if I bump the square edge up against it, I've still got at least a 2 or 3 millimeter gap at the bottom. So after spending more time trying to fix the riving knife, I just decided to get in touch with the customer support team from Evolution, and they told me, yeah, the riving knife shouldn't be doing that. So within about a week time frame, they came and collected it, and they also exchanged it again, and now the riving knife sits perfectly. Although this segment of the video is probably a little bit boring to watch, I must admit, it does also prove a point of how good their customer service actually is. I've had previous things in the past where I've had to ask for spare parts on the Evolution Mitre saw I've got, and within 24 hours I've received that part free of charge because it's still under warranty. Which does remind me that this table saw itself does also come with a 3-year warranty. Not a huge issue, but if you lower the blade down as low as it will go, the riving knife still sticks out. If you want to use this as a work surface when you're not using the table saw, that might just get in the way. Let's just take a look to see how deep the mitre slot is, and it's 10 millimeters deep, which is pretty good. The standard depth for a lot of mitre gauges, third party, would be 9.5 millimeters deep, so 10 is just a little bit deeper, but I've got no issue with that. Let's just check to see how wide it is. And 19.4 millimeters, which is pretty good. That's probably going to be the standard mitre slot sizes for a lot of table saws. The usual standard would be 3/4 of an inch wide, or convert that to millimeters would be 19 millimeters, and the depth would be 3/8 of an inch, or around 9.5 millimeters. So we are in the ballpark figure here. It is going to be a standard mitre slot size. which means that it should fit third-party mitre gauges, but just double check with the mitre gauge that you're going to buy that it can fit those measurements. So this is the mitre gauge here. It's just a combination of plastic and with an aluminium track and fence. I do quite like the handle. It's pretty much big enough for your whole hand, and that's quite useful for the next feature I'll show you in a minute. To adjust this fence left or right, you can just unscrew these little screws here, and then you should be able to move it back and forth, but for the time being I'll just keep that in the middle. You've got your angles here shown on the scale with your little needle point here, so you can just undo this, and that's when you can choose whichever angle you like. So let's just randomly put it back there, and let's see if it moves, and it doesn't, so it does hold it in place pretty well. Let's just try putting it in the slot. Runs pretty smooth. So I've noticed that it does have a bit of a wonk on, no matter where you put it. This might not be an issue, which for a reason I'll show you in a minute, but there's still a bit of a wobble. Similar to my Rutlands mitre gauge, there is a very small gap. It's not the end of the world, but again, it's a small gap. There is no adjustment on the bottom of this track of this mitre gauge where you can spread out to fill this gap, so you're just going to have to deal with it. And just one last nitpick with this mitre gauge: the black ends that you've got on either side of the mitre gauge, they don't actually sit flush with this piece of aluminium. They actually peel away a little bit, they actually bend towards the user, so they're not really giving you much support like that. And I've tried bending them back into place, but they don't seem to stay. So there is a cool feature though. You do also get a clamp with the mitre gauge, and that just goes into this bit here, and then you tighten it up. So now you have a clamp which you can raise up and down and hold your pieces down in place. So now it's time to show one of the most coolest features I've seen with this saw, and I haven't tried it yet and I'm really excited to. So there is a small hole at the start of the mitre slot here, and that's for this bolt here. So we're just going to put it over, push this bolt down, and it should be able to feel it connect. There you go, and then tighten it down. So now the mitre gauge is actually held to the table saw. And then if you look underneath the table saw, just below where the mitre gauge is, there's another screw here, which if you pull down and then twist, can you see the two pieces of plastic you can spin? So to keep it locked in, it will face from the user down to the rear of the saw, and if you pull it down, twist it, it will then fit in another groove here. So now it's going from left to right, and then what that does is now turns it into a sliding table. How cool is that? Runs pretty smooth. I think it's catching a little bit midway here. I reckon after some time it'll wear itself down and it'll be a lot smoother, and I'll probably get a bit of wax on that as well. But that is pretty epic, I must say. And then if you look here, you can see a bit more about what that bolt below actually does. So right now it's unlocked, which means that the sliding table can go over it, but then when you twist it, it then sticks out, and that's what catches on a hole underneath the sled. So if we just bring it back over, get it in line, and then let go, and then that's tightened back up, and that's not going anywhere. And then the reason why I said that this wobble might not be a problem is once you clamp it up, even though this is wobbling, because this piece of wood's clamped down, even though the mitre gauge might wobble, the piece of wood doesn't. And then you'd obviously make your cut here, and then return it back, and then you can undo it again. Overall, this is an awesome feature. I know they did it on one of their previous models, but to actually use one myself, it feels like a proper cabinet saw. Obviously it's not, and I know people are going to say it's nothing like a cabinet saw, but for a budget range, this makes you feel badass. So now I want to see if this needle is pointing exactly on 0 and it's actually a perfect 90 degrees to the blade. I already know the blade is a perfect parallel to the Mitre slot with that trick I did earlier with the straight edge, but I want to make sure that that number is also correct. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to loosen this so it can now move left to right. I'm going to put my straight edge up against the blade. Be careful that you're not touching any of the teeth because they do protrude out a little bit and that'll throw you off. And then you can just push the gauge up to the square, push it tight, and then I can then re-tighten this handle. And if we look at this number here, we can see if it's in line. See, now looking at this, I think we're pretty much square on there, but it's slightly pointing to the right, and my OCD is going to kick my ass if I leave it like that. So to adjust it, you can just get a screwdriver, and then you have movement where you can get it exactly in line where you want it. Retighten it, and then that is a perfect 0. So when you run it through the saw blade, it should hit a perfect 90 degree cut. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that the blade is a perfect 90. So I've already zeroed out my digital gauge, and straight on 90. Awesome. So now we know that the blade is a perfect 90 at the moment. It's a little bit difficult to see, but just behind the orange lever at the front, there is a bolt here. Now this bolt acts as a stop block. So when this is released, when I bring the whole mechanism back down, it will hit this stop block and it should sit at a perfect 90 degrees still. So let's just see if we're actually touching. So if I release this lever here, which now means the mechanism can be moved left or right, here is a stop block, and this metal piece here is what will hit it. So now that we've hit it, I'm going to re-tighten it and see if we're still at a perfect 90. So let's try this, and we're on 90. Now had this not been set in the right position, you can just undo this bolt here, and then you should be able to move this stop block left or right, and then you'll be able to adjust it where once you hit it, the blade should be at a perfect 90 degrees. At the moment, this is set completely fine, so I'm not actually going to touch it, but that's how you do it if you need to yourself. So now the blade is a perfect 90 degrees. I'm looking at the needle here, and from where I'm looking, that is bang on 0 degrees. So this needle doesn't need to be adjusted. Had this needle been pointed maybe too far to the left or too far to the right and not on 0, which it is on at the moment, there is a little screw at the back here, which you can just loosen up, and then you'll be able to move that left or right and then get that on the number that you want. So on the other side of the scale, you've got another bolt here, which is another stop block, but this time it's for the 45 degree angle. So let's just release a mechanism, get it to that block, and then lock it back up. And let's see if that's a 45 degree. And then, oh, bang on 45, that's awesome. So I haven't actually had to make any adjustments here. From factory, it's come perfect. Let's take a look at the fence. Now, I'm pretty sure this is exactly the same one as Rutlands, other than it's just got its logo on it and these are orange. But to attach it, you've got 2 bolts down at the front here, and you've also got the same bolts on the back of the saw. And you're going to line this bolt up with this groove here. So let's do that now. Just sit on top of it and it will fall in. And then once you're in, you can push the orange hooks down. And then now you're attached to the rack and pinion system. Now the difference between this bolt here and this bolt here, this one allows you to get right up against the blade. That's probably where you're going to be doing the majority of your cuts, probably within this sort of range. But if you just want that extra extension, you can always just take off the fence, put it onto these, and you'll get an extra 4 inches or so. Now, if you plan on cutting things that are wider than the actual table saw itself, then you've got an extension feed on the fence. It's just locked in here, compression, and you just pull it out, and then you can spin it around, and then you can lock it back in. There is no click, it just sort of fits in there, and then that way you've got support for your extra large sheet goods. Let's just see how wide of a cut you can actually make. So you're probably looking around a max cut of about 660 millimeters, which is plenty enough for me. And then when you're done with the extension table, just lift it out and just slot it back down into this. Makes a click. Another cool little trick you can do with this fence, if you don't want it on the saw but you still want to store it, you can always just turn it upside down and connect it upside down. And there you go. And then you can just bring that closer to the saw. So now let's see if we need to make any adjustments. So I'm just going to make sure this is actually 90 degrees. Oh, there is a slight bow in the middle there. You can see we're touching here. Then there is a slight bow in the middle. That's not very good. Yeah, it looks like it goes all the way up actually. Oh, it gets a lot worse there. Let me get my Rutlands and see if it actually fits. So this is the Rutlands fence that I've got, which I made a video about earlier in the year. Well, it definitely doesn't fit. It's not long enough. This is way too short. So, well, at least that solves that question. Let's just see that we're straight, going lengthways. And we're pretty good. I don't really have any issues with that. So now let's see if the fence is parallel with this mitre slot. We know the mitre slot is parallel with the blade, but let's see how the fence does. So there's loads of different ways of doing this. This is just the way I like to do it. There are different ways to do it, don't get me wrong. The way I'm going to do it is, I'm going to bring the fence up as close to the mitre slot as possible. I'm then going to get my straight edge and bump it up against the mitre slot itself and also the fence. And once that's flush, I'll then push the lever down to lock the fence into place. So now we know we're straight at the fence to the mitre slot here. So now let's have a look at the back. So now we're at the back of the saw. So if I then put my straight edge down, you can see I'm actually catching this lip of the mitre slot. And if I try and put them together, you can see that there's a gap, which means that this fence, this end of the fence, needs to slightly come further this way so we're in line. So to do that, I'm going to loosen this bolt here that the fence is currently sitting on. Now it's important to note that each bolt is independent of one another. So if I loosen this bolt, the other bolt on the other side is still going to be tight. However, because it's such a minor adjustment I need to make, I should be able to get away with just loosening this one here. So using the Allen key, the same one I use for the grub screws, I can just loosen this. And I should be able to have a very, you can see there, a very light movement. So let's get my straight edge again. Bump it up against straight. So we're straight there, and then I can re-tighten that bolt. So then we can check to see if we're catching still, which we're not. And you can see that we're flush with the mitre slot and the fence. So let's just see if we're doing the same at the back or the front still. No catching, and we're still flush, so that's good. If you want to use these black bolts for a longer extension, then you'll need to do the exact same process on these as well. You do also have a couple bolts on the left side of the saw as well for the fence. You can actually use this left-handed, but I'm not left-handed and that scares me, so I'm not going to do that. So now we know the fence is parallel to the blade. I'm just going to bump the fence up against the blade, and then I'm going to have a look to see if this graph is accurate. So we can see that the red line, which should indicate 0 because the fence is butted up against the blade, is slightly to the right. Real easy fix, just an Allen key here. you can just loosen. For some reason, this Allen key is a different size to the 2 Allen keys that you have, so you have to get your own. But then you're just going to slide that to 0 and then tighten it again. And there we go. I do quite like how clear it is to read. Red line on a clear plastic background, it just makes it a lot easier to see the numbers. So you may have noticed we've actually got 2 measurements here. You've got the silver up on top, that starts from 0 and then goes up in tens. But the one below it starts at 100 and then continues to go up in tens. And let me explain why that is. So if you remember, we put the fence onto this silver bolt here, and this is the one that can get right up against the blade, so there's 0 clearance. And that's why we're currently on 0 on the silver scale. However, if you put the fence onto the black bolts should be 100 millimeters from the fence to the blade. It can't actually get any closer to the blade when it's on these bolts. And that's why the black graph starts at 100 millimeters and not 0. When you're using the black bolt, you'll be using the black graph. When you're using the silver bolt, you'll be using the silver graph. It's easier to remember it that way. You just have to remember that when you make your adjustments to get the fence parallel to the blade, that you still want the distance from these 2 bolts to be 100 millimeters. But instead of measuring the distance from the 2 bolts, you might just find it easier just button up the fence as close to the blade as possible, locking it down, and then just measuring to see that should say 100 millimeters, which that is. The diameter of the blade guard extraction is around 40 millimeters wide, but you do also get this adapter here which you can just push down, and that's what you can use to attach your pipe from your rear of the saw. So I've got everything linked up, dust extraction all good, that's going straight to this vacuum here if you want to see what vacuum I'm using. So we're all ready to go to start cutting. So I've got all this linked up, so you should be getting some good dust extraction. And we're going to be starting with a bit of pine. This is just from a pallet, so it should be pretty easy cutting. So the first cut, as expected, pretty smooth. There are some slight blade marks, but because it's such a low tooth blade and you're ripping it, you're going to get them sort of marks. So I don't really have any issue with that. The soft start motor that this has, it worked really well. It wasn't a real jarring start like the Rutlands does. It just started off really smoothly and then it started to build up in speed. Overall, first cut, not too bad. Dust extraction, there is a bit of dust on the surface just from making that one cut. So let's move on to the oak, which is probably about 1.5 inches thick. I've got the extension table as well, which should support that, so it'll be a really good test for that as well. So let's give that a go. This is the cut on the oak, so really good. Again, you got very small blade marks, but I don't have any issues with that. That's perfect for me. So now for the big boy. So this is almost 3-inch thick sapele hardwood, which if you don't know, it's a species of mahogany. So this is an absolute lump of a piece of wood. I've taken out the bolt that's in the blade guard just so it actually can feed such a thing. Let's see how good that actually does. I thought this little piece there was going to absolutely kick back and kill me. So this is the cut here. Done an absolutely remarkable job. In fact, there's less blade marks on this than there were on the previous bits of wood, so I have no fault there. I was a little bit worried that perhaps the motor wasn't strong enough and it was just going to burn. I'd have to really sort of chug it through, but really good result. I'm actually very impressed with that, so no issues there. And this is the result of the dust build up from making them 3 cuts. Not too bad, it seems to just be building up here. It's pretty self-contained though, it seems to be only in this portion of it, and it's not escaping anywhere else, which is good I suppose, but I'll let you be the judge of that if that's good or not. Right, let's try 18mm plywood. So I've got the fence stretched out pretty much as far as it can go. It can go a little bit further, but I've also got the extension support on, so let's give this a shot. As expected, the cut is pretty good. There is a lot of tear out both sides, but again, it's a low tooth blade, so it's probably to be expected. But overall, pretty straight cut, not too bad. So now that we've done some rip cuts, I want to start trying the Mitre gauge and the sliding table feature. And I'm going to go straight to this beast here, because I'm pretty comfortable and thinking that it can handle it. So the maximum thickness you can clamp is around 4 inches of that. So we're good. Just take a look here. So this is the cut we made with a rip cut, and this is obviously the side we've done a cross cut. And no gaps. So at least we know that that's set to make a perfect cross cut, and the fence is parallel where it's made a really nice rip cut. Let's make a 45-degree cut, shall we? And we'll just go for something easy like a piece of pine for this. Now, it would have been good if this clamp had a quick release lock where I could just, you know, have the clamp go all the way down to the piece of wood rather than having to, you know, do this every time. Especially if you go from a thin piece to a large piece back down to a thin piece. I can imagine this gets a bit tedious. There was a bit of a problem there. For some reason, the sliding table hits its limit before it could make a 45-degree cut. Doesn't seem to come any further than that, and that doesn't look like that's a mistake either. Let me see if I can figure that out. So I figured out what's causing it, and it's this bolt underneath the sliding table. Now this is actually acting as a stop block, and it hits the front and the back of the sliding table, so it doesn't actually come off the saw. But you can actually undo this with one of the Allen keys they give you. So I've already loosened it with the Allen key, so I can just unscrew this with my fingers. You don't have to take it all the way out, you can just loosen it, and I'll show you what that does. So now that we've loosened the bolt, we now get a much wider range of movement. However, the catch-22 of doing this is because we've technically removed the stop block, the whole sliding table can now come off the saw. Now, obviously, this is so you can do maintenance to the rails. You can wax them or replace them if you like, but I think you're then restricted with 2 options of how you want to do a mitered cut. One, you can just use the Mitre gauge down the track itself like that, and then you can make your angled cut. Or 2, you can take off that stop block, using sliding table feature, but risk going too far and perhaps pushing the sliding table off itself, and then, you know, becoming a risk for the spinning blade. I'll leave that up to you of how you want to think of that. I'm not going to encourage doing that without a stop block because it's probably quite dangerous, especially for a beginner or someone who's maybe not expecting it. But that option is there if you want to do it. Let's just see if that's a 45, and no gaps whatsoever other than that one, but that's just because I didn't cut all the way through. But really happy, perfect 45. So let's try and make a 45-degree angle cut. I'm not going to go War and Peace. I'm just going to do 2 cuts. I'm going to do one with a rip cut, and then I'll do one with a cross cut. So let's give that a go. Clean cut, as I was expecting. Let's just see if this is a 45. And it is. So no issues with the 45. Let's try to do a cross cut now. This is the cut here. Again, really good. No issues there. Let's just see if that's a 45 as well. And perfect. I've got no issues with that 45-degree angle. Right, so I suppose it's time to test the thing I've really not wanted to test, and that is cutting metal. So Evolution claim on their blade that can cut steel, plastic, wood of course, and it should be able to cut through this 1.5mm steel. I've never cut metal on a table saw before, and I'll be quite honest and say it terrifies me. I don't know how well this is going to go. I'm only going to do 1 cut, and I'll probably never use it to cut metal. I'll just use an angle grinder or something. But I've taken the dust extraction off. I'm going to use a sliding table feature. So let's try it. This is the cut. It's actually worked pretty good. There weren't any sparks like I was expecting. Pretty clean cut. I'm genuinely very surprised how well that's actually worked. I was really nervous doing that, but that's boosted my confidence a lot. So very impressed. And that is the end of the video. So I suppose I better summarize this saw up. I think the question's going to be, am I going to prefer this to the Rutlands? Yes, I will, and for good reason. Although this saw has its own unique flaws to it, such as the mitre gauge is just wobbly, the fence was slightly bowed, although that wasn't really an issue in the end, they don't compare to how many pros this saw actually has. The blade guard with the dust extraction, much better quality than the Rutlands. The metal insert plate doesn't flex at all, unlike the plastic Rutlands insert plate. The mitre gauge is better, and come on, let's talk about the sliding table feature on this thing. It makes you feel like an absolute badass. You've also got the extension table, which again, Rutlands doesn't have, so that's an added bonus. It's bigger than the Rutlands, so again, really good. There are 4 different variants of this model. This one is the TBL Plus. I'll put a little graph here which shows all of the comparisons between all 4 saws. This saw retails at $379.99, so I'd say it's probably just on the higher end of a budget table saw, but I mean, I still think anyone should be able to use one of these saws. To me, I feel like I'm going to be using this saw all the way up until I actually, you know, get a garage where I can get like a proper cabinet saw. So I have no issues with this. I think this is going to do me really well. This table saw does also come with a stand. I didn't get a stand for this because there was a huge back order, and I don't think I would have got it for weeks because they had to manufacture a problem. Can't remember how much it cost. I think it's about 70 quid. But from what I've seen, the reviews are pretty good on it, and it also comes with wheels, so you can scoot it about wherever you want. And just looking through the manual, anything I've missed here, the decibels for this machine, it is quite loud. It's just like any other table saw, it is quite loud, so you will have to use ear protection. It says in the manual here it's around 106 decibels, and it weighs about 23 kilograms, which is only slightly heavier than Rutlands, but it's still enough for me to walk about with it. But if you're going to dump it in your workshop and never move it again, then fine. And again, if you do want to buy this table saw, which I highly recommend, then please consider following it through the link in the description or the QR code on the screen. And that way I can get a bit of commission, which will then fund to pay for another machine in the future, which I can then do another review about. If you like this video, then please consider liking and subscribing, or even just commenting to say that was really informative. Cool. I'll see you whenever I decide to make something else.